All right. Just to start the screen reader, this is or the recording. This is for the D3 presentation. To get started, I'm essentially showing a quote here from David McCandless, who basically says that visualizing information is a form of knowledge compression. It's a way of squeezing an enormous amount of information and understanding into a small space. All that to say that when you are creating a data visualization, I'm assuming you've asked yourself at least these questions for the most part. So what do you want to tell, what story do you want to tell with your data? Does the data actually tell that story? And what visualization best works for telling that story? And the reason I put that there is because, of course, we get quite a few requirements where someone comes to us and says they want a map, and then we have to back up and say, what do you have and why do you want a map? So it's really good to sort of think about the whole point of this is you're trying to basically tell a story with your data and making sure that your visualization tells the best story for that. So this is one really good example of one also by the person whose quote we just read. And this was essentially a visualization, I guess it's termed a balloon race. And essentially what it's trying to show is there's a ton of research or there's a ton of people out there talking about all kinds of wonderful foods and things like that they've eaten, and they swear that they cure cancer or kind of all the things like that. So essentially he attempted to scrape a whole bunch of data sources, medical files, this online web and stuff like that, and figure out of those claims, which one of those actually have really good backing to them versus which one of those are sort of snake oil. And the ones obviously closer to the top are the ones that have the heavier backing. And this is actually a really long visualization, so this is just the top clip of it. So you can kind of look at the rest of it. I have a link at the end where you can see like all the rest and go into the placebos and all that kind of fun stuff. This is another one that he did, which I thought was really cool, called Mountains Out of Molehills. And essentially what he's doing is scraping for things that were really big media buzz items that turned out to be not really much of a scare at all as they could have been. So essentially mapping out the correlations of different things. So of course you have like swine flu and bird flu and killer wasps and all kinds of fun stuff there. And the really cool thing I like about this visualization is that in doing it, he actually picked up the violent video games. Tends to be sort of like a reoccurring trend that happens through a sort of pretty common pattern throughout the year, which was really interesting. And he has theories on why that might be. Some of those include like because around when Columbine happened, and it might have a ripple effect. This is the way like sort of things sort of ingrain in cultures and things like that. So it's really interesting sort of making visualizations with your data you have and figure out, is there stories that your visualization is telling that you didn't even know were actually there? All right, into our presentation. So of course today we'll be looking over the D3 anatomy, which will basically be looking at SVGs or scalable vector graphics, CSS, cascading style sheets, and D3. We'll be looking at D3 binding, Drupal in D3, and then the last part is still Drupal in D3, but it's more heavier into the D3 side of things, so I kind of put it as D3 examples. All right, so starting with the beginning, D3 anatomy. Essentially, I usually look at sort of the overall architecture of building visualizations sort of going along this flow. You have some content somewhere that may or may not be there. If it's coming from like a Drupal site, then that might be sort of content you're starting off with. Essentially, you're trying to get that content into a structured format, and that's where structured data comes in. The typical ones we use are JSON and XML, but of course CSV is perfectly fine as well. And of course, in the end, you'll have your D3, which is your combination of JavaScript, CSS, HTML, and D3 being a JavaScript library. So D3 is essentially, as I was alluding to, it's a combination of things when we're typically working with it. So of course you have SVGs or scalable vector graphics, you have your CSS, HTML5 elements, JavaScript that you're working with. And we find ourselves very heavily using SVG as sort of a way of creating the visualizations we do. D3 is not limited to having to use SVGs, but for those that are more advanced with using this already, you don't really have to use SVG. It's just a preferred way because of the flexibility you get with that. So we're going to focus in on the SVGs, which are scalable vector graphics, and it's an XML-based vector image format for two-dimensional graphs and support with interactivity and animation. Some SVG highlights is it's a DOM API. That means you can basically just throw the markup in your browser, and your browser is able to figure out what it is. You can, of course, define vector-based graphics. So even though it's sad to say this because it's being deprecated, I heard, think of Microsoft Paint. It's sort of that sort of level of drawing arbitrary things. It supports SVG styling, element grouping, which is when you have when you're having data that basically ends up becoming different attributes, you can kind of group those attributes to do really clever things with them as well. It supports hyperlinks, of course, and then it does have accessibility support. You can throw ARIA attributes and things like that at it. And there was actually a 508 presentation yesterday that went over that pretty well, I think. And of course, it has path elements, which we'll get into. It's like a really cool feature of it. So as you can see, SVG has a really broad support range, so that's another reason why we find ourselves using it quite often. Some of the common SVG elements, you have the SVG element itself, which is essentially just sort of like the container. Think of it like the div of SVG. You have things that you can add into it, like circles, rectangles, and lines. You have paths, which we'll definitely get into, but that's like one of the cool things. You can sort of define arbitrary shapes, essentially. You have the G tag for grouping elements, A tag, which is obviously links, and you can add text attributes, which is where text comes in, or text elements. Of those elements, they have attributes as well, so you can fill them with different colors, for example. You can stroke them. You can do stroke width and stroke dash array, just different styles of things you can do with these layers. So to get into that, we're basically just going to start breaking down some examples of building out an SVG. So this is the way these work: is you have code on the right and what would actually be rendered by the browser on the left side. So in this first one, we're basically just adding an SVG container that has a width and height of 600 by 600. So pretty basic, and you don't really see much because it's basically just adding the container. Now inside of that container, we're going to add a rectangle with a width of 300 and a height of 200. By default, it usually colors, the browser usually will color it black, so that's why you see a black rectangle here. And then we're going to further add some attributes to that to give it a fill of a red color. We're going to stroke it with a black outline, and then we're just going to say that outline width should be 4. Now we're going to stack in another attribute, which is going to be, stack in another element, which is going to be the circle. And for that circle, we're going to add an attribute of giving it a radius of 8, and we're going to tell it to fill with the color purple. You'll see that our circle doesn't really look like a circle, it looks like a pie chart. The reason it does that is because we basically just told it to add it to the layer, and by default, it's going to add the origin of the circle to the 0, 0 position. SVGs have sort of positions. So 0, 0 is basically far left top corner. So of course, our circle is basically being cut off. So we can shift it over a little bit. If we move it with the CX and CY, we're basically telling it to move it 100 pixels to the right and 100 down. And that's why we can actually see our entire circle there now. And I shifted the rectangle just to get the whole outline in there. That's what that 1010 is. And then, as you probably figured out now, these are basically things we're layering in. So we can further add a text layer, which we then position as well, give it a fill of white, and that's where our white I love SVG comes from. Moving into paths, which are another element of SVGs. Basically, paths allow us to have arbitrary shapes or things that aren't necessarily always going to be a circle or a square. And these could be any path as long as we can define with that path, how that path is, and we use these to do that. So we have M, which is move to, L for line to, all these different things that basically allow us to define what that path or arbitrary shape looks like. And an example of that is say, for example, we wanted to draw a triangle. We could basically have a path, and we add our path, sort of the descriptor of that path inside of this D attribute. And we're going to say move, that's what the M is, to 150 by 150x, and then 0 coordinate y. So we're going to start at the top corner, the top middle corner of the triangle. We're going to make a line from there to 75, 200 coordinate. Then we're going to go from there, make another line to 225 by 200 coordinate, which is the far bottom right part. And then we have Z in there, which basically tells it to close it off, and that's what does the final line. And then that's basically how you get this triangle here. So now I'm sort of bridging more into how do we bring in SVG to style some of these things. Typically we use SVG for styling stuff like that because you don't want to really have, especially if you're building things that are probably going to have a theme or a feel to them and stuff like that, visualizations, you usually don't want to have like all of your sort of fill with this color and stroke with this color like all directly in your SVG. You might want to actually just add like attributes or add targeting attributes to those and then allow CSS to sort of dictate what they look like. And that's basically what we're doing here. So instead of giving the fill and all that stuff there, we're basically just having a style that's it's styling that SVG path selector with giving a fill of red, stroke, and the stroke width. So same outcome, we're just using CSV for targeting. The reason that's important and all this SVG stuff is important because these are basically the baselines of a lot of the visualizations we built. So the typical bar chart basically is built with an SVG that has somewhat similar markup to what you see there. So you're basically just adding a group of rectangles, you're throwing a whole bunch of rectangle shapes in there. They have all different widths and heights, which all end up looking like the little black bars that are there. That's your typical scatter point there. So you have, of course, your coordinate, your sort of Y and X axis, and then you're basically just adding in arbitrary circles and putting them at different points in the grid there. All right, so now we're bringing in D3. We haven't looked at a single D3 thing yet. That's all been SVG. So the D3.org is that, or definition is that D3.js is a JavaScript library for manipulating attributes based on data. The way I look at it is D3 is like sort of the glue between like your data and the SVG or whatever you're using to sort of visualize that data. So why should you use it? It has really good browser compatibility, easy to learn API. It looks a little weird kind of starting off, but once you sort of start getting in enough tutorials, it starts to make a lot of sense. You're basically just sort of iterating over things depending on like what you're trying to do, and that's what we'll see later. They have a lot of good examples out there, so you don't really have to write a lot of stuff on your own. Even on d3js.org, you can go on there and look at a ton of visualizations that are already there. Most likely, you can probably just throw your data in one of those and then tweak little things as needed. And then, of course, you get really cool out-of-the-box functions that help, and that's basically where the power of D3 kind of comes in and why we use it. So some of those, of course, these are like sort of the basic ones. So D3 has selectors, so think of it like jQuery a little bit. Even I could probably get in trouble for that, but basically you have like your select, which basically sort of selects one element. You have your select all, which can select sort of multiple elements. And an example of that is you would have like var svg equals d3.selectBody. We're basically telling D3 to select the body. And with that body, append a SVG element. And inside of that SVG element, add an attribute of a width and a height. And then we could also further say append inside of that a circle that then basically has the attribute or CX or CY. That's basically, remember how we position the circle, and then add in a radius of 40. So putting that all together, we basically can use that to create a, within that viz ID container, that div container that's all the way at the top, we're basically just telling it to add an SVG element to that, add those attributes there, and then within that add a circle. So same outcome, but now we're using D3 to do things. So now, of course, the biggest thing is you gotta, how does that work with your data that you have, and that's where D3 data binding comes in. So for that, we basically have the selection.data, and with that, that basically allows us to use our data to either iterate over it, which is what we use the update.enter, or you can actually even do things with update.exit. We're not going to look into that too heavily, but basically the point of that is if you have data that's going to be changing, you can sort of use that to respond to things being removed from your data as well. But this is essentially an example of bringing data in. So at the top we have a data set that basically is an integers from 5 to 25. We have a series of circles that we want to add. So we have var circles. We're going to select our circle. We're going to iterate over our data set. So that's where we have data and then data set in there. Dot enter basically is what sort of that's where we're into the actual iterations. For each item in our data set, we're going to append a circle. So we're going to create a circle. We're going to give that circle an attribute of a radius. And you can either throw attributes or they're sort of like a key value if you want to think of it that way. So we're telling it the attribute's name is going to be R, but instead of actually throwing a value at it, you can actually use a function as well. Those get really powerful because they allow you to sort of step into your data and do other things with it. So for this one, we're being very simple. We're just telling it to return, inside of the function, we're just saying return what that data is. So return D is just going to return either 5, 10, 15 as it iterates through. And then that will end up becoming our radius. And that's how we get what you see on the left there with these circles that basically have a radius of 5 and then 10 all the way out to 25. And then we basically just use the CX and CY and the fill to sort of position them where we want to, so they're not all just sort of lumped on top of each other and it just looks like one big circle in the end. You just want to kind of slightly position them to the right more and more, and then filling it with right. And we're going to look at, of course, more detailed examples, but from there, like this is basically just a screenshot from d3js.org, and there's a ton of visualizations on there. And if you look at like all the baselines of a lot of the visualizations, you'll see like sort of components of just those basic elements, and they're just sort of being really clever in the way that they're basically using the data to draw things. So there's also, I put this here because a lot of people feel a little overwhelmed coming into D3JS and making sort of visualizations from scratch. So there's a ton of sort of libraries that exist out there that basically use D3 as a base library and sort of add in additional things on top of it to try to make more sort of out-of-the-box data visualizations that you can use that are a little simpler to throw your data into and have a lot more interactions and things. And this is like a really good sort of chart of those. NVD3.js, which I think is the top far right, or top right one, is one that I've used a few times previously, and it's a really good one for especially putting together dashboards and things like that, where you just kind of want to get some really good stuff without much effort. All right, so now into how Drupal and D3 work with each other. So previously, I used to sort of use this or give this with the context of the D3 module for the most part. That's basically been a D7 solution. I don't think there's much that I've seen as far as porting it over to D8. So I've actually sort of put that away and have been using more of just sort of the classical use something that's basically going to give us our exported data, which Views, of course, usually is a really good tool for doing that. And then having just a custom module that basically then throws our custom D3 and make sure it includes the D3JS library and all that stuff. So I'll quickly sort of take a look at the D3 module part if you are curious about the D7, but the rest of this will go into the D8 and that method. But I mean, some of the highlights of it is like it's a simple API. You get out of the box visualization, so it comes with like sort of like a line chart and bar charts and sort of stuff like that. And it's sort of there's views integration where you could basically say I want to create a view. That view is going to export, or it's going to then render some type of like integers of some kind, and then I'm going to map those integers to different sort of out of the box visualization charts. And it's really good for that. There's just 4 of them, so you're not going to do everything, and it's not going to be the most wonderful thing in the world. But if you're just trying to have a very low effort where really all you have to do is know Views API, or the Views UI interface, then that's a pretty good one for you. And it also supports custom libraries you can create, so you can actually create your own visualizations that then sort of integrate with that, so you can go beyond just the 4 that come out of the box. But I find myself, again, using a lot of the classic sort of making a view that it's going to create your data and then having a custom module that basically then sort of brings it all together. That's what we're going to look at for the rest of this. So, let's see. With views, the overall sort of structure of what we're going to do is we're basically going to create a view. which is basically just going to be a listing of our data. We're going to use the REST API. You could easily, for this specific demonstration, you could easily sort of replace this with just one of the ones that exports like JSON raw, and that would work just fine. The reason I'm using the REST API is I feel like you kind of get more out of the box, and you have the ability to sort of, down the line, actually start utilizing more of the REST components of it and actually making your visualization make callbacks to adjust the data and sort of change viewports and stuff like that. And then we're, of course, going to be creating our custom module, which is going to add the D3.js library. It's going to output all the markup that we need, just the general sort of container and all that stuff like that. And then, of course, it'll also include our custom D3.js file. So that's kind of where we get into these D3 examples now. So this is the first visualization we're going to be building. This is sort of like the high level of this. I'm going to switch and just kind of show you the actual site using it. So the main reasons I'm doing this is because one thing to keep in mind, and I'll refresh the page, is that sort of visualization or that transition where it goes from like they kind of grow as it comes. That's going to be a part that we'll build in as well. And I'll just kind of pretexting on that one because when we first add that attribute view, we're going to add it with a width of 0, and it's probably going to be a little weird if you don't understand that we're making it grow like that, and that's why we're going to be doing that. So back to this, we're basically, essentially we had some of the data that came from the Peace Corps site, and it basically had it was sort of different countries. There was in Africa, and it had the amount of volunteer positions that were available overall and sort of the amount of volunteer positions that they had in total. And I thought it'd be cool to sort of make like little sort of bars that determine like what the need was for different countries that need volunteers. So basically we have our country names, and the blue obviously is how many volunteers have already applied for a position there. All right, so the way we would build this out is, of course, since we're using REST API, we're going to make sure we enable the RESTful web services and serializations modules. These are core modules. Inside of our view itself, we're basically going to create a view, and it's going to be a sort of a type of REST export. And instead of sort of going over the details here, I can just show you this. That's probably most of what we're going to be doing there. The thing to keep in mind is that, of course, we're setting the path to /countries API. So if you hit that, then you're basically going to get a raw export of this, which is basically going to export as JSON. And that's sort of what our format serializer is. We're exporting specific fields. So I have a title field. You can ignore flag for now. That's just sort of an image field. I was thinking of going even further with this. It's like all their country flags. And of course, the most important ones, it has the active volunteer totals, and then the volunteer positions. And I had a region that's more of just sort of for categorizing them, but all of them are currently Africa for now. So this is basically what we end up getting if we hit that URL. Of course, we see on the right is our JSON that basically has those same attributes. And again, ignore the flag field. All right, so now we get into sort of the custom module that we're going to create in order to pull this all together. There's a lot of files here. That's just because of the way sort of D3 works now with creating some of these things. But basically, you're starting from the top down. You have like your .info file, and that's what .info.yaml is. You have your viz.module, which basically we're just going to use for instantiating our block. The assumption is that we're going to render all of this inside of a block and use that as a way of sort of making this available where we need it. We have libraries.yaml, which we're going to use for both including our custom D3 library as well as including sort of the D3.js library file itself that we need. And of course, we have our JS that has those too. We have our plugins directory, which is basically just going to be where we define this block container. The templates, and that's pretty much all boilerplate for the most part. We'll go over that, highlighting it. So this is the info file, nothing special there, just showing it. So this is the actual the block for the block itself. The main things to keep in mind here is that we're basically just going to be calling our the D3.js, our custom D3 library there, and of course calling our theme. Nothing here, the biggest part that we're doing here is like you have this whole point of you can create your own libraries now, your JavaScript libraries. So all this is basically creating a library for the d3.min.js. You might have another module that already includes this. If so, you can just use that library. This is just the overall sort of D3 in general. And then of course we have the D3 viz source, which is going to be what we'll be looking at for the tail end of this that has all of our custom D3 in it. This basically, again, is just making sure that the block and all the theme and stuff like that render as it should. And this is our twig template for the block itself. Just for this demonstration, I did put like inline CSS in there. I know that's pretty much a violation. You usually have that coming out of your theme, but I didn't want to set up a custom theme for this as well, just to have that there. So I kind of threw that CSS there. But essentially, the most important part is you have your D3 viz container, and that's basically what we're going to have our D3 target and inject everything that we create using D3 inside of that container. All right. Now into what we'll be looking at for the rest of this, the D3 viz source.js. This is where all of our custom D3 is going to be. This is somewhat the typical Drupal boilerplate for making sure you define the behavior for your JavaScript and that it's included once. So this is sort of where it gets more into like the actual stuff that we'll be customizing now. So starting from the top bottom. Just for this, again, I'm giving this a width of 600 and a height of 600, so that's the entire sort of container of this visualization. Typically, when we build sites, that can be up in the air depending on where the visualization is going to be. We have some sites where we make this entire thing more responsive, in which case, like you have like other responsive attributes that you can add to that to make that height and width sort of scale as it needs to. The other one, the bar height, is basically just how high each one of those bars are, so I'm just hard coding that for now. And sort of going into the stuff that we kind of looked at earlier, we're basically just targeting that container that we had on there. We're basically appending our SVG attribute to get that to be created, or our SVG element to get that to be created. And we're adding the attributes of that height and width of 600, 600 there as well. We're then basically going into our data that we have coming out of the views. So we're basically pulling in that /countries API, which is of course the same path that we set up for Drupal to output that. And we're just checking for errors, which is always a good thing to do. So this is one of those functions that I was saying that, well, D3 comes with a ton of functions. One of them that I use very often is this scale linear. The wonderful thing that it does is when we're building these, we basically have these, we have this data that has like different values in it. But we want to make these become bar charts where we're trying to fix them to 100% always scales the full width of our chart. And there's all kinds of gradients in between that. You could do all kinds of fun math where you say like, let's iterate over each one and find like sort of the biggest one, and then let's take that and figure out how many pixels that would have to take up to fill up the entire thing and sort of scale all of our data from there. Well, there's an out-of-the-box function called scale linear, which basically helps us do all of that really easily. We basically tell it what is the actual domain. So the domain is going to be the actual upper and lower bounds of our data. So of course the lower bound is 0 because that's the absolute minimum that you can have. The upper bounds, we're basically going to have a function where we go in and we look for the maximum. That's why I have that d3.max, which is another really cool D3 function that we use a lot. And that maximum function is basically going to use the active volunteers total and the active volunteers available. Add those together and figure out whatever the maximum one is of that entire data set. That's going to be our max, and it's going to use that for that upper bounds. And then, of course, the range is what you're scaling that to. So 0 obviously is still the minimum range. And then the maximum is we're trying to scale it to the width of our display. And I just put it -20 so you don't have it like a bar going all the way to the absolute edge of the display. And we're going to use that. So for each one of these, we're basically going to be building out, remember we're building these out in layers. So the first thing we're going to build out is that sort of gray outline pill that looks sort of with the red arrows pointing to there. So to build out that part, we're going to iterate over the data. So that's why we have that data.enter. I should have started with, we're going to, for all these items, we're basically going to be appending a total bar class to each one of them, and that helps us keep everything nice and tidy as we render things. But for each one of those, we're basically going to iterate over each data point. We're going to add a rectangle that then becomes sort of the maximum of sort of whatever that width is. And to figure out what that is, we're going to sort of, if you skip all the way down to the lower red part, you'll see that we have the width that basically is a function that is going to basically return a value using that width scale. So basically we're passing all of our data and our numbers through that width scale to make sure that they all get sort of magically transformed to fit within where they need to be. And once that's rendered, we're basically going to then come back and do this blue part of the layer now. So this is going to be the actual positions that have been filled. And this kind of comes back to what I showed earlier when I showed the transition and showed that like they kind of grow. And that's why if you see there, we're setting the width attribute to 0 because we're going to use another function later on where we actually make all the bars grow to what they should be. But the rest of this, of course, is just adding the attributes that we need for that blue rectangle. The reason they look round is because we're doing that Rx and Ry, which basically allows you to sort of add, that's like the rounded corner equivalents of these. So we're sort of giving those rounded corners, but they're basically just the typical like rectangles shapes that we looked at earlier. And we're just sort of positioning them to make sure that they show up exactly where they should be, because again, we're going to be stacking each one of these one after the other, so we have to make sure that each one gets stacked on its correct row. So that's why we're sort of using the X and Y attributes there and setting those. All right, and then the last part, of course, is we have to figure out make sure that the actual label itself gets in there, and that's why we're using the text attribute. So we're adding the text in, and we're making that return. If you look lower, it's for the actual text itself, we're returning d.title, which is, of course, the title that was in the original data that we were looking at. So, of course, these are basically going to be iterating over each one. They'll be creating that outer bar. They'll create the inner bar set to 0 for now, and then they're going to also create that text bar for each one of these data attributes. And then now that final part of actually making the transition effect happen. Basically what we're doing is we're going in, and for each one of those, we're basically doing a select all on that progress bar. So we're basically having D3 look back at the rendered bars that we already created. Or remember, we added that class of a progress bar to them. So it'll select each one of the progress bars or the blue bars. And it'll we're going to add a transition to it. For the transitions, it needs a duration, which we're just sort of arbitrarily saying 750. So like less than a second, of course. And then for the actual value that we're transitioning to, because remember all the widths are currently set to 0, so now we have to tell it what is the final width that it'll be sort of transitioning to. For each one of those, we're going to do that width scale, which again is that magical function that makes sure that everything comes out to the correct sort of scale that it should be. And we're going to, through that function, we're going to basically display or return the d.field active volunteers total, which of course is our volunteers total. So that's how that gets passed through. And in the end, you get a bar that then scales to this width. Any questions? The second part is we're going to go into like it's going to use the same data set, but now we're going to kind of play with a map. But any questions on any of that so far?
Yeah.
Yeah.
The appends, when you append, is the last append layer to the top? Is that how that's working?
Yeah, it's a hierarchy.
Down in the order?
Exactly. Yep. So the last append will be the most recently thing that was appended.
So your text is on top.
Exactly. And I should have said that's another thing that you kind of have to keep in mind with these. It's really hard to kind of rearrange layers. So it's a lot easier to just make sure that when you're appending things and layering your visualization using SVG, that you just kind of put things in the right order the first time. It just saves you a lot of headache, even if you have to sort of iterate over data again and again, just to do that. All right. So now just sort of looking at a map example of this. So, of course, we have all of those. We have all the data there that basically has different countries in Africa. So I thought, like, maybe if we had because they don't have positions available in all countries in Africa. So I was like, just for a really good example, we'll look at if they have volunteer positions available in a country, then we'll highlight it on an Africa map. Right? So this is sort of still cascading into the previous example that we just looked at. So we're basically still using that same, we're just appending another container inside of that existing container that we had from the block, that block container. So now we're going to basically append another SVG attribute, or another SVG element, and this one will basically have an ID of D3 map container. We're going to basically use some grouping here, so that's why I have because we're going to append all the shapes inside of a group now. And we're going to, some of the important things to look at is we have projections here. Like for those familiar with mapping, you have all kinds of different projections, Mercator, Alvarez. It depends on which projection you're looking at. That's just sort of essentially the way that the world looks, assuming it's a ball and you try to smush it on a flat surface. And we basically are just throwing in some scales and things to make it sort of show up, to make our map center and show up the way we want to. And then this last function is a really important one. It's another sort of D3 cool function that you get. But essentially the D3 geopath is, what that does is, well, one, we have our projections, and we have the D3 geopaths essentially, let's see, I think the best way to describe it is it allows you to, we're basically going to be pulling in all of our countries from a GeoJSON file, and that's pulling in our Africa country from a GeoJSON file. That GeoJSON file is basically describing each country in Africa by these sort of shapes or boundaries that are used to represent what the shape of that country looks like. And what this function here does is it allows us to take that GeoJSON data and use that to output it into like the paths SVG attribute that we looked, or element that we looked at already. And et cetera does magic just to make sure that like that translate exactly correctly, and you don't have to worry about how do I convert like a GeoJSON shape into like something that is going to export correctly into an SVG attribute or element. So that's essentially what this is saying here. So given a geometry or feature object, it generates a path data string that is then suitable to throw into that D element or attribute of the path element. All right. So this time we're going to be looping over two different data points because we have our original view that's outputting all the countries and the sort of positions, the volunteer positions available. And now we have our new data, which is this Africa GeoJSON file, which is basically just a path for each one of the countries in Africa. So essentially we're saying with the Africa GeoJSON file, we're going to loop over all of the country data inside of that. And we're going to do this. All right, so starting from the top down, we're basically going to select all of the paths. When you select a attribute that doesn't exist, it's the same thing as creating it. So basically, we're telling it to create paths, and each one of those paths, we're going to use the map data or the maps to generate that path. We're going to enter into it. So, and we're going to basically figure out for that current country in Africa. Yeah. Oh yeah, question. Oh, 5 minutes. Okay. For that current country in Africa, like, does it currently exist in the data set? If it does, we're going to fill it with that RGB color. That's it's actually blue, but that's with the RGB 158202. We're going to fill it with blue. If it doesn't, it'll skip all that and it'll just stay with that default color that we set earlier of CCC. And we basically just sort of add in we use that magical function of geopaths as the returning data for deep. which then allows it to magically convert that GeoJSON data that's coming inside of our Africa country into what is needed in order for that shape to actually be rendered. And of course, we just are going to do a stroke and things like that just to make it look nice. And that's basically how we get the visualization that looks like this. Definitely take a look at it. I know it's a lot to very quickly go over. I have in some just resources that I have here on this sort of things you can look at to learn more. Some of the ones that I'll highlight is the last two. They're not really D3. They're more of sort of data visualizations in general. 2 TED Talks, which are really awesome, and just sort of breaking down like sort of the power you get and things that you should keep in mind when building these. And these are, of course, links in the presentation. So with that, any questions about anything? Sure. Oh, up there. Go ahead.
This may be a super basic question. D3 includes the map libraries?
D3 includes functions that you can then use for maps, but as far as the actual maps themselves, then you still have to get those from wherever you get your, like the map shapes.
Right, the map shapes, that's what I'm looking for.
Yeah, the map shapes, we use census.org as a really good way to get some of those. You just go there and you can sort of generate any map shape that you want. The only downside is you then have to they're usually very high resolution, so you have to take them and kind of downgrade them to whatever resolution is adequate for sort of what you're trying to use for your visualization.
So where in your module are you defining those shapes?
Those are actually coming, so the first line, we have an Africa GeoJSON file already.
Okay.
And I'm just including that.
Gotcha, thanks.
Mm-hmm. Did you still have a question?
Yeah, this was all Drupal 8?
Yeah, Drupal 8, yep.
Can it be easily adopted for Drupal 7?
It is, and it's really the same solution for the most part. Of course, the biggest difference is you're going to be obviously having a different way of making a custom block and all that stuff. But as far as like once the D3 is there, I can like rip all that D3.js and I can just throw that at anything else. I can throw it out of Drupal. It doesn't really need to be there. It just needs a container and it needs data. That's it. Yes?
Great presentation. Can you post the link again that you had at the beginning for all the files that you had?
Sure.
Thank you. I guess there's not a major push to have a module available just as plain drip module for D8, is there?
Not that I saw. I mean, again, I feel like it's really cool to have it in practice, but whenever we're like in the wild, especially for the visualizations we're usually creating, we're usually way off into custom land anyway, so we don't really find ourselves using it much. But it's a nice one if you're if you're new to it. Yes.
So if you're creating like more than 2, like say 5, 10 D3 visualizations you want to be using across your site, do you keep those all in that same source file, or how do you keep those?
I would definitely break them up, and probably, assuming you're using blocks, I would have like different blocks or container, whatever container you use for them, and different JS files just to kind of keep them nice and tidy. And then if you find yourself, if those all kind of interact, then you might even want to say like maybe going with like something else to sort of pull them together either. I don't want to say Angular, but stuff like that. Yes?
Does D3 facilitate responsive design? Do the graphics that you're creating using it work well on mobile?
Yeah, they usually do. Usually the most we have to do is sort of making sure that the overall container sort of responds, so the actual SVG element itself. But beyond that, everything inside of it usually scales really well. And that's kind of why we have a lot of things using our width and height. It just kind of helps to make sure that stays true. Yes?
You referenced several libraries, frameworks that build on top of D3.
Mm-hmm.
Do you generally use one of those frameworks, or do you go straight to the underlying D3?
It depends on the requirements. If it's something where we're building a dashboard that's more meant to just sort of quickly allow people to interact with data, then some of those are really helpful, like MVD3 or if you're on a hackathon or something where you're just kind of like trying to very quickly, like time is of the essence and you're really trying to bang something out, then those are definitely good for that. But a lot of the things that we find ourselves building are really sort of one-off things where a lot of the presentation and the arrangements of things is very intentional, as well as color schemes and interaction. So we typically might find ourselves not being able to use much of the predefined ones, or possibly using one of those as a baseline and tweaking it from there. Yeah.
Just a quick comment. I've been using the leaflet module to do mapping,
Mm-hmm.
and the one thing that it can't do is this type of map is called a choropleth map.
Oh, right.
So this is great.
Right. And I know I want to say that there's some ability, because I know we had some solutions previously that allowed you to sort of layer in stuff on top of that, where you can get away with sort of trying to layer stuff on top. It can be a little complex.
Yeah.
But it's definitely possible. And I will say that this is more of, there are some solutions out there to try to make it more like geo-aware and stuff like that. But so I wouldn't use D3 as like a navigational tool by any means, like for trying to get somebody from point A to point B. But as far as visualizing things and stuff like that, it works really well.
There's a good module for that, IP geolocation with views.
Oh.
Do all that other stuff.
All right, good to know.
And that integrates with Leaflet.
Okay.
Printing content that's created by JavaScript can often be a nightmare. How do you deal with it?
The fun one. Let's see. It usually prints fairly well for the most part. I had a previous one where I used, what is the name of that? There's a few JavaScript libraries that basically aim to try to print things and even on the fly convert them to PDF and things like that. And I know I had some issues where I had to specifically tell it how to interpret like some of the SVG attributes and also make sure those got printed out fine. But usually those weren't, like once I had those, like there's a ton of people that already have done stuff like this, so usually it's just more of finding out like what you have to do to include to make sure your SVG is supported in that as well, and throwing it out there. But usually for printouts, I haven't really had just much problem with just the browser itself being able to print that out. It's been more of like sort of third-party JavaScript tools trying to use the browser to scrape the page to then generate like a CSV or a PDF or something like that. All right. Yeah. Okay. Well, that's it. Thank you. Thanks.
Hey, just a quick question. I missed the beginning of your presentation. Where can I watch it after that?